Hello and welcome. NeoCon, in partnership with AEC Daily, would like to welcome you to the NeoCon 2021 CEU presentation, Research Tools, What You Need to Know Now, presented by Sally Augustine, Brian Gilligan, Ellen Keeble, and Casey Lindberg. This presentation qualifies for 1 AIA Learning Unit and 0.1 IDCEC Continuing Education Units. In order to receive a certificate and credit, you will need to attend for the duration of the presentation. Within 3 business days of the session being completed, you will receive an email from AEC Daily with a link to access your certificate. Your AIA credit will be reported to AIA within 7 business days, and you can self-report your credit to IDCEC. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please submit them through the questions box and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to our presenters.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I think we're going to have quite an interesting and informative session. Well, designing offices where people achieve their professional objectives requires information about users, how they work best, space and use experiences and expectations, and a range of other important topics. And having that needed information has never been important than now. Today, we're going to hear from 3 very well-respected workplace design professionals pioneering the use of important research tools and methodologies. First, we're going to hear from Casey Lindberg, who's a senior design researcher at HKS. Casey?
Great, thanks, Sally. Let me share my screen here and hopefully it'll work. Does everybody see?
That would be a plus.
All right, great. Okay, just turning up my webcam. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do here in a relatively quick fashion is give a primer on some of the methods that we use to connect design intent to design outcomes, or in other words, measure their impact. I'm a design researcher at HKS, and my background is in psychology research before going back to the field of architecture and kind of combining some of those methods to measuring those outcomes and impact. And what I'm going to be talking about sort of throughout the presentation is not so much about the results, but about the methods and the layering of different types of data to gather meaningful insights. So we often have human data, whether that's observed or self-reported through survey stuff, spatial data, whether it's about actual spatial characteristics or spatial analysis using software, or environmental and sensor data, which might be more objective or still subjective through humans telling you about that data. And each is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses, as you can imagine. So that's going to be another thing that I kind of touch on throughout. And we're going to start off pretty simply here with some survey data. So when our employee workforce of about 1,300 went home at the beginning of the pandemic, we had the opportunity to measure them and see how things were going. And what we did was we sent them surveys every week for a while and now much more infrequently. And we asked them questions like, how was your experience working from home last week? And you can see that we measured that over time. And that's really what to kind of take away from this plot and on the next slide as well. So the power that you can really get, even if you're stuck with kind of being limited in that moment to one type of data collection, which was just sending out surveys, you can still layer that with itself and track things over time. And the way that you can do that is by asking the same kind of questions with the exact same kind of wording. Hopefully this is a validated measure taken from something in the scientific realm that has been validated and tested as reliable. And then you can keep asking those questions over time to track. So as soon as we sent our employees home to work from home, we asked these questions, and you didn't really know what to do with the data at the moment, right? You could connect different variables, you could find existing data sets in the world that had normative data, but you didn't really know how you were supposed to stack up to that. But over time, you can really monitor those trends. So just for example, we can see that the overall work from home satisfaction was really variable at first. This is just a couple months of data at the beginning of the pandemic. And then just for instance, another thing here that you see a lot of movement on is frequency of video usage in meetings. So behaviorally, we changed. Before the pandemic and at the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have our video on much. And right away, we kind of made some policy and cultural changes to address that. Now we use it much more. So again, the power here is consistent wording over time to measure trends, even when you're limited to a very small amount of methods. I'm still stuck in that very, small amount of methods where we're just talking about subjective data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative data through surveying. There's actually another kind of objective data that we could measure, and that's some environmental data. So here you see some sort of an infographic here comparing spaces where people were working from home based on whether they were in an apartment or condo or a single family home. And again, the data here or the findings here isn't super relevant right now, but it is interesting as a case study. So here we were able to connect this, by asking people this objective data about their environment to their feelings about their access to nature. And we found that using a variety of different kinds of questions, those that were in single family homes had much more access to nature than those that were in apartments or condos. So that was either, having balconies, patios, being close to gardens and parks, or actually just having a view of nature from inside your home. Another thing that we were able to do, again, just being limited to the survey data, was to talk about or get some insights on the ambient environment as well. I'm not going to get into the weeds on this plot, but it's actually a pretty insightful plot, and it brings together a lot of the types of data that we gathered using a couple of different questions. So on the y-axis there is the impact that each of those satisfaction ratings on each little icon had on overall work from home experience. And then on the x-axis, it was its own satisfaction. So however you were satisfied with, let's say, personal security or risks of injury on the far right, those are very, very satisfied. But as you go up the plot, the more meaningful connection they had with the overall work from home satisfaction. And that allowed us to target in that sort of colored bubble there a few things that had a high return on investment or had the highest sort of bang for your buck. So those are things like acoustics, temperature, access to nature. And what's interesting about those specific three things, access to nature, thermal comfort, and satisfaction with acoustic conditions, is that they were much higher ratings than people gave when they were in the office. So we asked a bunch of these similar questions, again, the power of asking similar questions over time, and we had people rate their office conditions well before the pandemic in 2019. And access to nature, your thermal comfort, and your satisfaction with the acoustics was much higher at home, actually whether you were in an apartment or a single family home, than when you were in the office. So that gave us some meaningful insights by kind of being able to ask those questions over time and connecting that to some spatial conditions and environmental conditions. Another much more robust tool that we have at HKS is using what we call a living lab. This is sort of an industry term. Living labs are all over the world, and what they really are is an engine or a framework by which to iteratively test different solutions out and see how well they work. So if something in your space isn't working as you had hoped because you had measured the impact of that outcome, you can then ideate, come up with new ideas, have some new design intervention or policy intervention, and test it again. So it's a really cyclical thing. It's a really cultural commitment to testing. And it's a really dynamic system as well. And so within that framework of the living lab, and we began to be back in the office and use some of these methods more recently, last couple of months. These are just some examples of some of the tools that we use a lot. So ambient environment, we just mean sensors there. So sensors for carbon dioxide and particulate matter, temperature, relative humidity, sound, light. Snapshot and pulse point surveys are just what we call experience sampling surveys. So that could be sampling people multiple time points over the course of a day to ask how they're feeling in the moment, which gives you different insights than, say, the single global one-time measurements that you might see on a traditional survey measure. In various projects, we can monitor through other types of sensors, energy use. We can model carbon footprints. We can do spatial analysis on floor plans to see how connected spaces are or how integrated or visible. And we can do behavior mapping. So we can actually take people, physical people, to spaces and have them monitor other people and what they're doing in time and space. Not shown there is a very close related tool, which a lot of people use, which is occupancy sensing. So using sensors in a room instead of people in a room to kind of gauge what's going on. And there's a variety of technologies that you can use there. And there's other kinds of data that you can layer as well, right? So different kinds of interviews and focus groups, HR data, professional development data. And what I want to do is give you just a feeling for a couple of the insights that you can get when you use these different types of methods. So this is our office in London, which is one of our living labs. And the upper left plot shows what employees felt and what the conditions were as people moved from an old office space to a new office space. You can see that says there's a 26% increase in thermal satisfaction. But what's interesting on that plot is that we layered not just their feelings about how comfortable they were in terms of thermal satisfaction, but also on that plot is the actual degrees that were measured on average in that space using sensors. And I think most people can easily agree that temperature is one of the toughest things to have people all satisfied on, but we at least got the overall averages to their ideal kind of level in this space by tracking both of those things and layering both of those things over time. The bottom graph shows the importance of measuring CO2. So the interesting thing about CO2 is that compared to, let's say, your acoustic conditions, like how loud a space is, how bright or dim a space is in terms of light, or how cold or hot a space is, our bodies aren't very well sort of made to be able to tell small differences in carbon dioxide levels. They have to be pretty extreme for us to be able to tell those levels. But they might be really important. In fact, a lot of research points to having lower, for lots of reasons, but including cognitive performance. So having lower average carbon dioxide, as you can see in the new office, compared to the old office, is hopefully something that will help people think a little more clearly and a little bit better on complex cognitive tasks. I mentioned behavior mapping a little bit ago, and this is an example in our Chicago office of our studio floor plan. And the dots here just represent where people are more of the time. So over the course of a couple of weeks, over a couple of times, people went around with iPads and clicked on the floor plan where people were and were able to record what they were doing. And that's one of the benefits of using an actual person to come in and kind of see what's going on in a space. In a second, I'll tell you about some of the advantages of having sensors do that work for you. As you can imagine, there are pros and cons of both. But what this allowed us to do, even though we could have done similar things with sensors, is show that there are a couple areas that were not activated to the degree that we thought they're going to be activated. So there's a specific design intent for one of those spaces. For instance, the space on the right is a pinup area, and we wanted that to be a very active area where people were pinning up their work and collaborating all the time. But that didn't seem to be the case based on the data that we were collecting with people's own eyes over time. And that's nice because in a living lab culture, it gave us an opportunity to have a solution and test out solutions that could activate that space. And there are a variety of things that we tried and eventually ended up working based on where people were sitting and who was sitting where tended to be the key there. This isn't our space, but it is a company that we have worked with called Enlighted. And Enlighted makes sensors. So they have a variety of different kinds of sensors, and they go in the ceiling and a grid. And the point isn't, to talk about one specific kind of sensor, but there's a very big difference between having a person go around every hour or two and kind of log what people are doing and where they're doing it, versus having sensors, which can be up sort of indefinitely. And they can be deployed in very large spaces over very long periods of time. And that's sort of one of their strengths, right? It's a non-intrusive way to measure where people are moving in time. And what you see here are common paths of movement throughout a sort of open office space. So I mentioned layering data as being very important. We have a tool called Onion, which does just this. So a lot of these methods, even if they're very subjective and qualitative, can often be tied to physical space. So for instance, if you ask people how comfortable they were with their visual conditions or their acoustic conditions, you could plot that in time based on where they're sitting if you ask them where they're sitting. And you could layer that with a bunch of other things like spatial analysis, occupancy sensors, environmental conditions in the moment. And historically, those have always been very disparate systems. So you've only been able to visualize one at a time. And what Onion does is allows you to really layer those together and make inferences on how the design intent is meeting its outcome goals, and then be able to adjust. So here's a very simple example. We just talked about that Chicago studio space with the not very active space on the far right. And we can layer that with different kinds of spatial analysis and occupancy sensors and behavior mapping to really understand a little bit more about why that might be the case. The last case study in terms of methods that I'm going to mention, just real briefly here, is the University of California, San Diego. They have a new part of campus called North Torrey Pines Living and Learning Neighborhood. And this is a project in collaboration with neuroscientists there at UCSD. And the reason I'm showing it is that this is a much different scale. So there are a lot of different goals with this project. And you can see some of the design intents here of how to more activate areas outside. But it's not a small indoor space where you can easily have some sensors up. Here we have large scales that are outside over a large chunk of a campus. But you still can have people go and sit in spots that you care about for your design intent and see what people are doing over the course of the day, over weeks. And so we did that. We had people go and just kind of monitor what kind of activities people were doing outside. And because you're actual people noting what other people are doing, you can tell the difference between, for instance, individual activities that are going on in time and space and group activities that are going on in time and space, and monitor those things over time. And what's more, you can talk to people, right? So layering that with the very subjective interviews or focus groups, you can see what people are saying and connect that again and make stories for how that space is operating. And if it's not meeting its outcome goals, then you can come up with solutions and test again. So here's just some example of what you can do with that data. You can see how individual activity in a certain zone is changing over the course of a typical day, and contrast that with group activity. Some things might be getting a lot more common, some things might have a peak and then decreasing in frequency. And here's my second to last slide here, just a reminder of how powerful it is to layer different data within a single project. So this is that same project, but we also, of course, as you can imagine, had a bunch of survey data. And we're able to show through a variety of metrics that have been validated, a reduction in depression, improvement in satisfaction with diet, and overall satisfaction improvement with their ambient environment. So the things that we saw, exact same questions that we saw in some previous slides. So this is just, I think I've hit this point enough today, but again, there's lots of types of data, from human data, spatial data, environmental data, and the power really comes from layering those things, since they all have weaknesses and strengths. And with that, thank you for your time.
Okay, all right, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you very much, Casey. We're going to be holding all questions till the end. If you're in the audience and you have a question, feel free to add it to the chat. And in a few minutes, after all the speakers have had a chance to present information, we'll start with those questions. Next, we're going to hear from Brian Gilgan, who is a professional engineer and sustainable design expert with the Office of Federal High Performance Buildings at GSA.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sally, and welcome everybody. Pleasure to speak to you today. As Sally mentioned, I'm a sustainable design expert with the General Services Administration, also a member of the research team for health and buildings in our agency. And we see really an unprecedented opportunity for GSA to what we call reimagine our workplaces over the next many months as our workforce returns to the office. And we want to make sure that in that process, we're building in and encouraging healthy strategies, as well as measuring outcomes consistently over time. And so our discussion today will be a little bit more high level and initial than the presentation that Casey just gave, because we're in the process of developing this approach now. If we go to the next slide, please. So the key question that we've been asking ourselves is, would better data accelerate improved adoption of healthy strategies in buildings by our leadership within GSA? And I believe the answer to that question is yes. An example that illustrates this is a recent lighting retrofit that we conducted, employed a number of advanced lighting technologies, as you can see. The benefits were very clearly estimated and articulated for reduced energy use and satisfaction that we expected to see, improvements in satisfaction accepted by leadership. However, we also tried to estimate the potential productivity gains from the improvement to visual quality that we expected. We did this using a tool called HBEST, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but the intent was to try to give a rough order of magnitude sense for what the improvement might be worth. And if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that the anticipated gains greatly outweighed the costs and also the energy savings that were estimated. Unfortunately, this wasn't very persuasive for a number of reasons. Seems too good to be true was one of the comments. Another was it's hard to attribute this to the specific instances of our building. But it's unfortunate because even as a rough order of magnitude sort of estimate, the potential gains dwarf the capital costs and energy savings, and we really want to try to make this more persuasive over time. So that's one of the points of what we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. So what's standing in the way? I'd say a number of existing challenges. There's not a standardized approach to measurement and verification of healthy strategies. Human measures can be expensive and complex, hard to scale. There's not a lot of field study data that involves human measurements now, so there's less confidence in predictions that you make for particular situations. And so as a result, owners, at least within our sphere, don't really trust predicted values, or at least don't base decisions on them. So our objective is really to develop a standardized approach that we can repeat at scale, leverage GSA's large portfolio to gather a lot of data, and then create feedback loops that'll help us validate these predictions that we're making with the tool I identified. At the very least, we want to get people comfortable with the idea of using rough order of magnitude calculations to really prioritize different healthy strategies. Should we prioritize before we know a lot about it, HVAC improvements over lighting, that sort of question. Next slide, please. So I mentioned an unprecedented opportunity. I do want to frame this a little bit. Over the coming months, our federal workforce is most likely going to be returning to the office. And in that process, health and safety are front of mind. So in that environment, and knowing that we're going to have to really redesign our offices, as work has changed, the approach to work and the workplace is going to change as well. We know we have this opportunity to rethink our workplace. And in fact, GSA will be conducting what we call workplace engagements, develop design requirements in all 11 of our regions. We really want to make sure those focus on health enhancing strategies and incorporate measures for understanding the efficacy of these strategies over time. If we're successful, we should be able to leverage this in our engagements with other clients. And so the potential is there to scale this fairly quickly if we're able to do it. Next slide, please. So our point of departure for this approach is really to do consistent measurements, as I'd mentioned. So a number of kind of categories of measurements that we're going to make will seem similar to some of the things that Casey was talking about. But basically, we want to make sure that we're gathering information about the design features that are present in each of the locations where we do these engagements. So stuff like what are the conditions of floor plan layout, what are the types of mechanical systems that are in place, lighting systems, what are the access that people have to views, et cetera, and how does that change? We want to make sure that we're gathering some organizational attributes. A lot of this has to do with HR, PD data, things like the number and average salary of employees, absentee rates, what is the home to work policy, that sort of thing. We want to measure responses to surveys. Primarily, this will be satisfaction with indoor environment, but you'll see in a second that there are other things we're going to be looking at too. We want to use sensors to measure indoor environmental quality, as well as occupancy, where budget allows. And then as an emerging part of this, we want to make sure that we're capturing at least some physiological responses as well, based on those projects where we're attempting something significant, as I'll mention. In each of the projects, we also want to use this tool, HBEST, to predict the value of potential IEQ improvements. And as far as we can, use the data that we collect to try to validate those predictions. Next slide, please. So our point of departure for that is something that we call the Total Workplace Scorecard. The scorecard was developed by GSA in conjunction with a multidisciplinary group of experts in the health and buildings arena, really to encourage project teams to adopt a range of workplace strategies. Principal among those are those that we know to enhance occupant health. These are strategies that will do things like improve ventilation, improve lighting and acoustic design, improve thermal comfort, and incorporate biophilic elements. The Total Workplace Scorecard is a really robust platform for project teams to get to know what those strategies are, and then consider how they might be practically applied in their project locations. The scorecard then also can track which strategies are adopted, so that we can do meaningful pre-post comparisons and even comparisons across multiple projects that attempt the same sorts of strategies. This tool is really meant to be a public good. It was developed and deployed on our on GSA's sftool.gov site. There's a live link to the tool here if you're interested in learning more about it. And we are also happy to do demonstrations of the tool as well. But this is basically our point of departure for selecting strategies that we want to try. Next slide, please. If the scorecard is a point of departure for strategies, employee surveys and sensors are going to be the core of the measurements that we're taking. So our employee surveys, we have one primary tool, and we're developing a number of others currently. But the primary tool is really meant to be a global survey to measure occupants' perception of health, comfort, and performance in a way that will be standard across our projects so that we can provide pre and post comparisons as well as comparisons across projects. We've also developed sensor guidance to help our project teams procure sensors meeting reset air for commercial interiors, both for the sensor itself and for the way they're deployed. The guidance also addresses IT security requirements for GSA buildings, which has been a major stumbling block in some of our projects in the past. Again, these resources are also available for use free on GSA's sftool.gov. I will say that these will be modified and enhanced over the next couple of months. So if you do look at them, continue to watch this space. Next slide, please. The final tool that I want to talk about is the Healthy Buildings and Energy Support tool, this HBEST tool that I mentioned before. HBEST was developed by the Department of Energy through the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. Our office helped in its development. And basically, it's a tool that's meant to help project teams create a business case for energy savings projects that also improve health. It's meant to be low cost, low burn way of creating these kind of rough order of magnitude estimates that I'd mentioned before. And in a nutshell, how it works is that it is basically based on a survey of existing research into how the indoor environment influences health and how deviations from kind of ideal settings can affect health. And that creates a kind of estimate of the magnitude of improvement that's possible in a given site, and that can be monetized. So the HBEST toolkit provides a simple analytic tool that takes data that you gather to develop those rough order of magnitude estimates. It also includes a data collection guide and an equipment loaning library for sensors to measure the indoor environment for federal project teams that don't have that equipment on hand. But anybody inside or outside of government is free to go to the website that's listed here for PNNL to learn more about this tool and make use of the calculator and the data collection guide, at least. We are intending to use this to estimate the rough order of magnitude potential benefits of strategies that we might apply. Next slide, please. So I want to talk really quickly about what GSA is going to attempt to do on the workplace engagements in our 11 regional offices. As a base, what we call our base tier of engagement, we're going to use the existing tools and programs that I just mentioned. So every project that we do, we're going to try to do a scorecard to identify strategies, a survey to measure at least the satisfaction with the indoor environment, gather data on organizational attributes, and collect spot measurements of IEQ, and then use all that data to create predictions of future value using the HBEST tool. Where budget allows, we're going to try to do the base plus tier of research, which is really about adding continual IEQ measurements from a sensor network and also some point-in-time surveys possibly. Again, the base plus is using a network that's going to conform with reset air for commercial interiors so that we can gather consistent quality data about the indoor environment. And then we also, as a kind of an upgrade to the facility, want to make sure that we're creating feedback loops that allow us to improve operational control of our building systems. The advanced tier is going to be used less often. This is where we're going to gather actual human outcome measures, but we're only going to do that where design warrants. So in those places where we identify a significant potential value for improvement, and we note in the scorecard strategies that we're going to pursue that seem like they're going to make a difference, that's where we would measure this human outcome measurements. And that's because the human subjects data is sensitive, fairly difficult or relatively difficult to collect. It would have to be collected under the guidance of an institutional review board, which is something that we're in the process of finalizing now. And it would require trained experts to actually take the measurements and interpret the data. Probably that will be done through PNNL or one of our consultant contractors that have been trained to do this. So again, the advanced tier is where we look at human outcome measures. And I want to, if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the process that we're using to try to understand what we're going to measure and when. So again, we convene a group of multidisciplinary experts in the health and buildings field to help us really look at what are some common measures that are used in research projects, and how can we balance the research value that they bring with the cost and difficulty of actually implementing them. We wanted to make sure that we could collect enough of these strategies where we can, or these measures, where we can measure each of our healthy strategies, but also avoid redundancy. And so you can see kind of a list there, and the ones that are up at the top are going to be perceived higher value by this group, while also being less difficult and less costly to implement. This is kind of a way that we use to initially prioritize what we're going to measure. If we can go to the next slide. Here we'll see our first take, or what I'd say is our draft take of our research protocol. So on the left, you can see the areas of focus, the things that we think are important areas to improve in the indoor environment that will have a connection to improved health. You can see then the strategies that the scorecard, at least at a high level, that the scorecard identifies to try to make improvements. And then for all of those, at the very least, we're going to measure satisfaction with the indoor environment and try to measure using sensors the indoor environment itself. Where project teams actually implement significant strategies, we will also do some additional surveys and some of the physiological tests. So for example, under acoustic quality, where our project teams implement a significant number of the recommendations made in Sound Matters, and they're spelled out in the scorecard, and we would augment the satisfaction surveys with self-reported productivity and possibly a cognitive test. Where our project teams try to achieve increased ventilation and filtration strategies, then we will do the same self-reported productivity and also deploy a sick building syndrome symptoms survey, as well as use actigraphy to measure sleep quality, possibly develop or deploy a cognitive test, and look at absentee rates. Under biophilia, where we look at biophilic elements or try to improve access to views or do a biophilic design plan as part of the design requirements, we would deploy a mood and stress survey. Under lighting quality, where our project teams try to increase vertical illuminance, or balance vertical illuminance rather, increase circadian stimulus and reduce glare, we would look at tools like a sleep quality survey and measuring sleep directly. And then finally, under thermal comfort, where we pursue strategies that expand individual control of the indoor environment of temperature, usually by reducing the zone size, but also perhaps by deploying personal comfort devices. We would look at self-reported productivity and balance that with a cognitive test and looking at absentee rates. So this is really our, as I mentioned, our first draft of this set of research protocols. We're going to continue to refine this with our working group. And then within the next couple of months, we'll finalize this. And just like the other tools, we intend to make our research protocols available to the public to understand. Over time, we may consider adding measures where we generate more confidence in our ability to do so at scale, or we may choose to drop some of these off if they don't seem to be working the way we need them to. But this is our initial point of departure, and how we hope to incorporate consistent measures of not only the indoor environments and reported satisfaction, but also physiological outcomes. If we can go to the next slide. And that's basically the approach that we intend to be taking. As I mentioned, the next few months and years are an unprecedented opportunity for us to apply this to a changing portfolio. And we're really excited about our opportunities to do that. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions at the end of the session, or you can feel free to reach out to me at the email address that's listed here. We are also available to set up demonstrations of the different tools that we've mentioned that are available for public use. Thank you very much.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for joining us today, and that was a wonderful and insightful and important presentation. Next, we're going to hear from Ellen Keeble, who is a workplace performance strategist and a change management expert at Jacobs. Ellen?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk in a little different way about what meaningful data is. As a social scientist who shifted from academics to design in a design firm, one of the things that I've had to come across is what makes data meaningful and how to balance some of the things that Brian was talking about the value of different research against its doability, and its rigor with its applicability. So I want to talk first about why. Next slide, thank you. So some of the things that we ask, why do research, and particularly why do it in the context of a design firm working with clients. I want to give a shout out to the Environmental Design Research Association, a group that I've been involved with for 30 years. We had a recent summit discussion amongst the community within EDRA of researchers in professional practice. And a lot of the points that I'm going to be sharing today came from some of the discussions with my peers, including Casey and others. So first of all, why? One of the first questions is, why are we doing research in general in our firms, and why are we doing it for a particular project, initiative, or internal process improvement? Because to have meaningful data, we need to know where we're going and have a plan. So rather than starting with tools first, which is often what we find our clients say, oh, well, let's do a survey. I always say, no, let's go back to what do you want to know and why do you want to know it, and what are we going to do with the information? So when we talk about informing decisions, that has a timeline. And we need to know when we need to inform the decisions, when what decisions are being made. Are they pre-design or are they value engineering? Why? Are we being involved in making a business case? Are we looking at the value against the rough order of magnitude of costs? And who does it matter to? Does it, is it only mattering to us as professionals that we need, a North Star to guide us as we go through our alternatives? Or are we being asked to investigate particular questions or issues or use particular methods that are important to our clients? And then finally, what does it look like? So in informing decisions, we may need to make sure that our results are quantifiable in a way that can be used as in a trade-off analysis or to have a checklist. If we're measuring impacts and outcomes, for example, that will guide us to particular sets of methods that may be more quantitative or more linked using qualitative methods like a survey to quantitative methods such as retention and attrition rates. And then if we look at learning and innovation, that may be our internal value, our community, our worth as a firm, as professionals, that we are continually learning and improving on our work that we do with our clients, our education amongst ourselves. And particularly, I want to push this is confirming or confronting, that's the word I was looking for, confronting any bias that we have in our work. So if we go on to sort of the question is, what do you want to know? And I find myself doing this over and over again. It's a very simple question, but it is, along with why, what do you want to know? So that when we look, a lot of the work that we do as social scientists, we're very, very interested in people. But one of the weaknesses in the literature in environmental psychology and the social science literature is it doesn't describe place very well. So the previous two presenters did a fabulous job at outlining how you need to collect data on place, on the spatial constructs. So because at the end of the day, if you find that a particular environment is deficient in environmental satisfaction, in productivity, in other outcome measures that you're interested regarding people, you need to know what aspects of that place are correlated to those outcomes. And increasingly, as we look at the future of how we all work and live, place also is virtual and place is technological. So place is a much more complex construct than we have encountered before, and we need to embrace the variability. So we look at organizations like the Leesman Index, who does standardized surveys across organizations, or other groups that do a lot of research and inform our knowledge base about how work environments impact our health, productivity, and culture. They are knitting together the total user experience. And if we start with our user experience, we need to look at the elements of place that are involved in that. And right on that heel is tools and technology. So lately at Jacobs, we've been talking a lot about work practices as well as work processes, and being very connected at the hip with our digital technology groups that implement things like running NASA's space centers, we have a lot in common with them about how we think about research and how we use research and about research contexts. And so what do you want to know is important to get the elements right. Next slide. Because we need to frame our questions correctly. We need to understand sort of what are the things that are staying constant that we want to measure conditions and what are our outcomes, or in social science language, independent and dependent variables. And so as we look at these, again, very basic, but put them on the wall, who, where, what, how, when, and why. Both when we look at the people, the place, the technology, and the organizational context. And I think Casey did a really nice job of showing that if we are looking at these questions of when do we need to use the data? What are our opportunities for collecting the data? And how is this impacting decisions or insights or learning? When does that need to happen? Because that will very much frame the context of how we gather meaningful data and use it. Next. So I want to quote our industrialist leader today, who says, measures of success should link directly to the reason that the project was initiated. So if the project is to improve health and safety, then we want to make sure that we measure health and safety. And so going back to those goals are very important, and even more important are how we engage with our stakeholders, our clients, the people that use our spaces, about what is important to them, what their priorities are, and what are the goals for our engagement with them to begin with. Next. So when we look at data sourcing, one of the things that we're finding increasingly is that sort of the landscape has changed for the better a lot. In the years that we've been doing design research. So when Brian, offers to share the tools that GSA has spent a lot of time developing, take him up on that offer, because there's a lot there. There's also a lot of research, and I'll show at the end of this presentation a link to research. I'm going to say it wrong. Excuse me. Research Design Connection. I was going to say it wrong. There's a couple different sources, but this is a compendium, a summary of research findings about particular environments, about environmental types, about people's experiences. It's really, really useful if you need to do a literature review, which I highly recommend for data sourcing. Look at what already exists, conduct a secondary review so that you understand what is the knowledge base out there and how does it relate to your particular project. Of course, what we're talking about today, a lot is collecting your own data, but it's also important to look at your stakeholders, what existing client data they already have. So if there's already sensors embedded in the environment they're using for other purposes, first of all, you need to discover that, and second, it's important to be able to leverage the data. One of the things that we find very useful is to form partnerships with the IT and human resources groups, as well as business, to understand what data they routinely collect, either through surveys, through like exit surveys for people that are leaving the company. There's an opportunity to embed some questions about the work environment in it, or they may already be collecting that data and asking those questions. So it's important not to stay just with the facilities group or the client that you've identified with, but to look at the range of ways that the organization is collecting and using information that may be useful to you. Also consider subcontractors or businesses with well-established tools. That's what a lot of people are doing for sensors, and there are a lot of services that come with it. If you use a reservation system for unassigned workspace, there's a lot of good data that you can get from that reservation system, and also have query your suppliers about what kinds of opportunities there are to collect data over the long term, particularly if you're working on multiple projects over time with a particular client. Next. So in resources, I think we've covered this, consider your schedule. A lot of research, traditional research is time intensive. And if you're in a very short schedule and this is a one-off project where you don't have availability, to compare to other projects that are with your client, you may have to really target your methods and your approach to fit that schedule, as well as your budget, what you have available as tools, what are the talents. You may have some very talented people in your organization you may not even know about. I found we had some anthropologists in my group that I didn't know about. They had come in to do a totally different job in the scheduling group. Well, once I found out about their training, we leveraged them to do behavioral observations. And just what is your access to data, people, and place? There may be human subject ethics issues that are important to consider that may limit what you can do and how you do it. Next. So when we look at collecting data, collecting new data, we have to really evaluate what do we have, what do we need, and how do we need to fill our gaps. And as Casey was talking about layering, very important, key issue, key thing, using multiple methods. And so we have to consider as we do these methods, what is the process we're going to use, and really think of it in terms of a UX experience, so that we have to plan. Who are we interacting with? How obtrusive or unobtrusive can we be? And balance depth, getting insight into why, as well as observing and breadth for representation. And so the depth and breadth are always a trade-off. And so an example would be a very large-scale survey and sensor data looking at behavioral patterns, but do you know why? And so a depth would be some type of method tool, such as an interview or a workshop, to understand sort of why are people not using this space. It may not be the design attributes. It may be something very different. So before we make a judgment about changing the space, it's important to know why. Next. And have a plan. Always, it's very important to have a plan for collecting the data, so people also know why are we collecting this information, what are we going to use it for. And some of the main types that have been covered in the earlier presentations are directly observing, and usually observing people, behaviors, and also physiological reactions, as Brian was talking about. Measuring the physical conditions. I cannot stress this enough. So much of the I was a reviewer for the journal Environment Behavior, and in my review comments, I would say 9 times out of 10 to the authors of the studies were, you have not described the physical conditions sufficiently. It is not enough to say it was an open office. Were there partitions? How high were they? What was the size of the workspaces? What was the ratio of workspaces to collaborative spaces? And what were the acoustic conditions, the lighting conditions, and the air quality conditions of the space? Asking about experiences, feelings, judgments, insights, having people do projections. There's a lot of methods out there that really rely on this interacting with a group, and it can be very useful to work with a particular group over time that can become informants and go with you on this involvement and co-creating journey together. Next. And so as we look for, what do you do with the information? You have this information, hopefully you know why you collected it, what you're going to do with it, how it relates to your goals, but then you need to interpret it. And this is where interpretation and really looking at your bias and making sure that you have countervalences to your bias are important. So to have insights from stakeholders, have insights from your peers, outside reviewers who may not be as close to the project, about what is the meaning of this data, and comparing it to where you started. So what are your goals, and what were the objectives for this space? Assessing against comparable research, does it make sense? Do sort of a logic check, because sometimes it doesn't, and that's often when I may go back to my user committee or a focus group or key informants and say, can you give me some insight into this, or do we need to collect this data in a different way for confirmation? And then really embedding this ongoing inquiry and testing and engagement is part of how we do our work, so that it's not a one-off, and the tool that we are able to collect information across projects, and particularly if we are working with clients or customers who have multiple projects, to really build it into the way we work with them, so that it's always a learning journey. But in all of it, to respect, from an ethical point of view, and from just good business practice, to respect the confidentiality of sharing these results, both how we collect individual responses, but also how we present data outside of a particular project. Next. So I have just some simple questions. We have these in the CEU, and I realized I might not have covered them in the presentation, so I just want to go through these. There's 3 questions. Which research methods provides the most accurate information about what people are doing in a place? So in this, we're looking at behavior. Is it a group interview to ask people what they did, observing people, doing a survey, or sensors? And so this is a bit of a trick question. The correct answer, next slide, is B. And the reason it's B is that I asked about what people are doing. So you're literally observing. And I put in without knowing you are watching, unobtrusive observation, so that the fact of your watching can sometimes change what people are doing. Sensors also monitor how many people, and the way I describe it here, are in the space at different times of day, like the heat map we saw earlier, but we don't know what they're doing. And so that's why, to get that information about what people are doing, really the most accurate information is from observations. You may not be able to do it. You may, in a questionnaire, people recall what they're doing. They think about, well, what was I doing there? And that is one step away in terms of accuracy from actually observing. Next. Timing. Which of the following is a better time to compare how well a group is collaborating before and after moving to a new workplace? So this would be a pre and post occupancy evaluation. So when would you do the post occupancy evaluation? So the correct answer, next slide, is 8 weeks after the move. In terms of these choices here, sometimes we say 12 weeks after, or another time frame, again, depending on the project, and sometimes the changes are incremental. But 1 day after the move is way too soon, as is 1 week after the move. But 2 years after the move, that may be a great time to take the data, but you want a comparison point about 8 to 12 weeks after the move.
And speaking of timing, I think that if it would be possible for you to finish up in the next
this is the last
couple
one.
minutes, that would be excellent. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you. This is the last one. Which are the following things which can cloud our judgment when evaluating how well a place is working for its users? Next. All of these. If we've created the place, it's been cited as a great place in publications, or we dislike the place. All of these can create bias and cloud our judgment. So we want to make sure that our research methods are objective and that they allow us to confront what we think we're going to find out with what we actually find out. So the next slide is just resources. And you'll have this, Research Design Connections, Environmental Design Research Association, and a great new resource Sally was telling me about, the Transdisciplinary Workplace Research Network, if you want to dive into really good, deep, academically based research.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. I'm sure we all not only enjoyed your presentation, but also got a lot out of it. And I'd like to, ask at least, a couple of the questions that have come in as, in the course of our session today. And the first question I'd like to ask has to do with IAQ sensors. That is a topic that several of you touched on, more or less. And since Casey spoke first, he gets to answer this question first. And my question would be, what are some of the challenges in using IAQ sensors, Casey? And then others can join it.
Yeah, and I really appreciated Brian mentioning some of the resources that can help navigate this, because to be honest, it's a really frustrating and tricky environment, no pun intended, to be in terms of trying to select a set of tools. And it's become even more difficult, I think, in the last year or two. And the reason is the demand on the part of the casual sort of consumer to understand what they're breathing, what they're seeing, what they're hearing. And it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, especially this pandemic was the catalyst for us to want more transparency about what we're experiencing, what we're breathing. But the problem is there's a pretty limited amount of information out there. The science just hasn't gotten there yet in terms of how exactly to lay out your sensors in space and what other things you need to know about the environment in order to do what you need to do with the data. And it all kind of hinges on this question of what's good enough data for my question. And that's a really hard question to answer sometimes. So the sensors that are available out there for purchase, they all kind of seem the same. You can't really tell what the difference is between them. So you have to turn to things like Reset to see which ones are certified. And then we'd love to hear if there have been updates on SF Tool for their guidance on their placement. But I know from my experience, it's really about understanding that the good enough data might not be understanding that that particular value is exactly right, but measuring patterns over time. And beyond measuring patterns over time or its association over time with other important variables, you can't really do a whole lot with that data, right? You can get very large magnitudes of differences over time. And if something's terribly off, you can usually tell. But it's a frustrating place to be. Yeah.
Anybody else like to talk about sensors?
Go ahead and mute, Brett.
Brian, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. The problem with controls there. Now, I would just add that I agree completely with Casey that there's a lot of challenge to understanding the why in terms of where you're placing sensors. Our immediate interest was really just trying to create a minimum standard that would be consistently applied across projects, and that's why we selected Reset, both for the quality of the instrument, but also for at least a minimum standard of how many sensors we're going to deploy. In many cases, we're going to try to deploy more sensors than are required by Reset because we're really interested in getting an idea of the kind of differences between spaces that are high use and tend to change a lot in their use, but also so that we can start to use kind of advanced techniques to use IEQ to understand how spaces are occupied and maybe a little bit about what people are doing. It's a little bit experimental, but that's something that we're interested in trying. To be honest, the real problem that we've had has been meeting our IT security requirements. So the idea of a consistent vendor who can provide a range of products that have already met the requirements of our IT security is going to be, I think, the biggest improvement that we're making in our process. So I would just mention that cybersecurity is becoming an increasingly important issue everywhere, but it's really important in government.
Ellen, would you like to talk about sensors? I have a special question for you then. Ellen, and then everybody in turn. I was wondering if you have a favorite new tool you've learned about in the last year or two, something you've heard about, maybe got a chance to try, some new way of collecting information. Anything popped up in the last couple of years? Anything intriguing, interesting?
Well, one of the things that it's not really a tool for collecting data, but I've had the opportunity to use the interpretation of data in a different way. So we did a survey. I led a survey internally at Jacobs. We had a 50% response rate, which was about 26,000 responses globally across the country. So it was a large data set. And I got to know our digital group very well. That does work on a whole other things at Jacobs. So I was able to form partnerships across my company with people I had never really worked with before. And so we did a Power BI dashboard and spent a lot of time looking and enabling people to take dives into the data for different reasons. And I thought it was incredibly useful, because I was looking at it with one lens, for workplace trends, because we're looking at flexibility strategies for the future, but was able to work with people and guide them through doing filters and dives of their own for questions they had about workforce engagement, about all kinds of things that I never even thought about. And so it first of all informed what I should ask in the next survey, but also was just a really good learning experience for me about thinking about that data is not a report. It's ongoing source of knowledge.
In our last minute or so, Brian or Casey, would you like to add anything about something new you've seen recently? A tool, a methodology, a way of analysis, etc., that might intrigue our audience?
I want to be a little bit careful about the kind of some of the product demonstrations that we've seen, but I'm intrigued by the idea of platforms that exist and they're apps that basically exist on mobile phones that can be used to integrate data that you collect in different ways. I think that's becoming a little bit more seamless how you can knit that data together and then actually link in feedback loops from occupants. I'm intrigued by it. It's something that we're only starting to explore though.
Excellent. And that is a good point. We're not out to be an ad here for one product or another. The goal is just to get people's minds going on what's happening out there in the research world. Casey, do you have anything you'd like to add in negative 30 seconds?
I think there's a lot of, I mean, I shared my frustration with the environmental sensors, but it really is also a super exciting field that's developing. And I think the most exciting stuff I've seen almost come together, but not yet quite come together for different companies that are in this realm, is connecting different layers of data. So whether it's having an occupancy grid on your ceiling and then also incorporating sensors for environmental conditions in space, and layering on top of that how people are feeling by answering things on their phones. You can do all this, but it tends to be in these little silos where people are really good and really have that investment. It's very rare to have a package all come together, and I'm excited to see that happen because I think it's going to happen pretty soon.
Excellent. Well, something to look forward to, as well as we'll look forward to NeoCon next year. So I want to thank all of our panelists and our audience. And I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
I'd also like to extend a warm thank you to Casey, Brian, Ellen, and Sally for presenting today. I would also like to thank all of the learners who have taken the time out of their day to attend this presentation. As a reminder, you can watch this session again on demand anytime between October 8th and November 6th via the NeoCon Hub. If you are viewing this presentation for the first time on demand, your credits will be reported to AIA and IDCEC on your behalf, and a certificate will be emailed upon successfully completing the quiz at the end. We hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.